It's time for a sew along. Grab your pattern because today I'm taking you from start to finish with New Look 6263. Grab your favorite fabric, make sure you've got all your notions ready to go, and let's get sewing. Hi, I'm Tony, and this is So Lounge. Now, today we're going to be going through all the steps in New Look 6263, which is this cute A-line dress. I'm going to be making version A, which just has the basic collar with a slight V-neck. It's got bust darts in the front, no darts in the back, and a super simple closure. In fact, this would be a very easy pattern but for the slightly complicated neckline attachment. I have all of my fabric cut out. Now, if you're like me, you want to make sure you read over your pattern instructions before you sit down to sew, because that's when I realized I needed single fold bias tape. I don't know how I missed that at the very bottom where it says thread, 2 half-inch buttons, and a pack of half-inch single wide bias tape, but I didn't realize that until I was going step by step and figured out that's how we're going to finish the armholes. Now, the fabric I'm using is this big polka dot. It's kind of graphic looking, and I'm going to be using white bias tape with that. It's going to be folded to the inside, so you're not really going to see it. So don't stress if you don't have the perfect color on hand, and it's just something that will complement the fabric that you're using. When you read over the instructions and look at this neckband attachment process, it looks very complicated. Don't worry, the most complicated part of it is going to be making sure that you have the pattern pieces marked, because there's a lot of very specific stitch between the 2 large dots, stitch between the 2 small dots, and if your dots aren't properly marked on the facing piece, which is the one that does not have the interfacing, you're going to have problems. So make sure you get everything marked on all the pattern pieces before you get ready to sew. Now, I know that's the boring part. I hate doing it too. This has been taking forever to get this video going because I just did not iron in the interfacing and transfer all these marks. Like, that's the one step that was holding me up. Here at So Lounge, we like to take things a little tiny step at a time, and any kind of progress is good progress. So if you've only got 15 minutes, pick your fabric. Find one you like. Make sure you got some single fold bias tape on hand and a couple of buttons. Maybe that'll take less than 15 minutes. If you're feeling ambitious, wash and dry your fabric and iron it and get ready to cut everything out. Then another 15 minutes, you can lay out all your pattern pieces, make sure they're on grain, and pin them all down. You don't have to do that and cut it out unless you've got a little extra time. So no stress here to get it done in one day. This is not any kind of fashion competition show. We like to take our time, and I don't want to stress you out during this process. I have my facings cut out. So the facing is the one without the interfacing. The neckband is the one that it has the interfacing, and this is all how they're referencing it in the pattern. I have my pieces pinned together. So you should have one long piece and 2 short pieces, and they should be all pinned together. I like to pin things before we get going. Next, I'm going to make sure that the little V-neck part is all ready to go. It is. It's got interfacing on it. It's marked, so that piece is ready. I've got my single fold bias tape over here. I'm not sure if that's enough, so I've got a fresh new pack ready to go. And last but not least, my actual pattern pieces. You want to make sure that your dart markings have all transferred to your fabric. I like to slide my tracing paper between the 2 pieces. That's why I put right side up, because then you can mark them both at the same time. And the one last thing I need to do is transfer this large dot at the center of the neckline, because that marking did not go all the way through to the other side. So I'm just going to unpin and flip my pattern to the other side, which you can totally do if you want, and you want to just mark everything that way. It's totally fine. I just think it's a little faster to try and get it all marked in one go. And we are good to go. Everything else went through. Let me just double check the back, make sure the markings here all transferred. Now, this is not my usual heat vanishing pen. This is a different pen. I will put a link to it in the description below so you can find it. The problem, of course, with the heat disappearing ink is that once you go to press your garment, it causes problems because all of your marks vanish. And we do not want that happening on that neckband because that will make our life so much more difficult. When you look at the pattern instructions, the very first step is to do some stay stitching along the front piece and along that neckline because we're going to be adding the neck band attachment later and we do not want to stretch that out. Now, if you're not familiar, stay stitching is just stitching on a single layer of fabric at a regular stitch length. It is not at a basting stitch. It's whatever you use for everything else. And we are just going to be stitching. I'm just going to line up the edge of my presser foot and we're stitching inside of the seam line so that we don't have to cut this out later once we attach. In theory, once we start grading the seams or reducing the bulk in the seams, that'll get caught up and cut out at some point. Now, before I move on to the stay stitching, I'm going to pin my darts in place because I want to just move to the sewing machine, and Minky is making a cameo appearance today. I just want to put my darts in and have them ready to pin, so that way as soon as I finish my stay stitching, I can just move straight into sewing my darts. I've got everything pinned together, and that's how I like to start off my projects is just take the time, get all this first set of seams pinned together. So for me, that means I have the back pieces pinned together on the center back seam. I have the darts pinned in to the front piece, and then I have my facing and neckband pieces all pinned together so that I can just get that all done all in one go and not keep getting up and resewing every time we get to a different step in the pattern. Now, as I mentioned, first step is going to be stay stitching along that curved neckline on the back piece, both back pieces and the center front piece. To do that, I am just going to line up my presser foot with the edge of the neckline and just slowly sew around that edge towards the center. Now, with stay stitching, they want you to sew from the outsides in to the center, even if it would be a continuous seam. They don't want you to push the fabric towards the other seam. So just keep that in mind. It's kind of weird. You're going to have like two hanging threads in the middle of the front piece, but that's just kind of the way it works to make sure everything stays on grain and works the way it's supposed to. So I have my top piece stay stitched. Now I'm not going to sew the darts yet. I'm going to put this to the side and sew the stay stitching. I just don't want to forget to do it on the back. And when you're sewing on the back, you're sewing from the outside of the garment in towards the center back seam. So you just go all the way. You don't have to worry about stopping in the middle like you do with the center front piece of the pattern. All right, stay stitching is done. That is the good news. So I'm going to come back, sew my darts next. So I've got my darts all pinned and lined up properly. When I pin my darts, I start at the bottom and then pin at the top and then kind of figure out where it's supposed to be in the middle. And then I just kind of finger press the fabric to give it a nice crease. Now I am starting from the outside seam and working in towards the point of the dart. Now, as I sew, I always trim off these loose threads as I go. Some people say you don't need to, it's just an extra step. But personally, I find it very aggravating when I've sewn a seam and there's some random thread peeking out at one end or the other. And so that's just kind of the habit that I've gotten into. Of course, you can do whatever you want because you're sewing your own project. If you don't like doing this, skip it. If you like doing it, then by all means, now is the time to do it. Next, I am going to the center back of my garment. I'm going to start at the mark that I marked, the large dot that is up at the top of the seam line. When we finish the closure part up here, we're going to end up folding this over twice. So that's why we want to make sure that we start at that dot and go down from there. Now, when I sew, I always start at the top of the seam, that would be at the top of the garment, and then I work my way down to the hem. The reason I do this is because If your fabric was cut a little bit off, it's easier to work that out in the hem than it is to work it out at the top of the seam where there's either a neckline or some kind of a neck finish. Maybe you're attaching a collar, or at the top of the seam that's going to be going into a sleeve where you need to have things a little bit more exact. If your hem at the bottom is a little bit uneven, you can always trim it out or put that excess into, the actual hem itself, and it's a lot less stress. When I made my patterns in college, I never matched up the patterns to make sure that the seams were the same length on pieces that were connecting to each other. And so this was a solution I came up with, but I found that depending on how your machine feeds the fabric and how long the seam is, it can get off a little bit by the time you get to the bottom. And that's where I'd rather have the unevenness than anywhere else. Now I am going to backstitch at the top of this seam because we are going to be doing some folding later and I do not want this to come unraveled. All right, that is all sewn. I'm going to trim off my threads. I'm going to pin the front and the back pieces together because that is the next step. Let me make sure that's the next step. Oh, no, it's not. Okay, so I'm going to put this aside for right now because we are not ready to sew the back to the front yet. We need to attach this weird V piece to the front of the neckline before we attach that neckband. So to do this, we are going to attach the right sides together. Let me flip that around. And then we're going to match up those markings so that they are all together. Now, if you didn't interface this little V part, it does need to be interfaced. I didn't do that the first time around. And then once I was reading the instructions, I was like, oh, that does have to be interfaced. So this is going to create the notched out part, the notched out part under the neckband that kind of adds like a little bit more interest to that neckline. All right, so I jumped the gun a little bit and reread the instructions yet again because reading the instructions is an ongoing process. Always check back. They're there for you. They don't always make sense, but sometimes if you read them enough, they will start to. So for direction number, which one is that one? 2, it says to apply the interfacing, but I did that when I cut everything out. And then it says to finish the edge. Now, I was talking to a friend the other day and we were both discussing how patterns don't tell you to finish seams anymore. And I don't know if they ever did. I was trying to think about that the other day. And because that's something I've always struggled with is remembering to finish my seams. I'm getting better, but it's just one of those things where you're like, do I do this? Do I not? So anyway, they actually said to finish this edge. Let's see if I can double fold it over, if that'll work. And then maybe pin it in place. Minky's looking very adorable, sleeping on the ironing board, but she's going to have to move because we need to use the ironing board. Okay, come on, baby. All right. Okay. I'll get rid of the cat hair later. For now, let's get this finished. And since I'm over here, I brought all of my pieces so that I can just press everything all at once while we're here, and that way it will be ready to go for the next step. Now, when I press interfacing, because I am pressing the neckband and the facing, I want to make sure that that interfacing is protected from the heat. And so I'm going to use a press cloth. This is just a piece of muslin. I'm just going to press open these seams real quick, press my darts in place, and then finish that edge. I'm going to go with I did this right. I matched all the notches. Yeah, that has to be right because it just looks funny. So if your neckband is looking funny, don't stress. It just does. Because there's no notch in the center back seam. Now this is why I did not use heat vanishing ink when I marked these parts, because I need those dots to all stay in place while I press open these facing seams. Okay, moving on to the center back seam. That one is done. And last but not least, I'm gonna press the darts. This helps if you have a pressing ham to get this done with. If you don't, you can always just roll up a hand towel and use that. So now we're ready to try and figure out how to finish this little V part, and the fact that it's all interfacing is certainly not helping. I'm going to try and just hit the edge. I got to turn down the steam. This is burning. Okay, that seems to have worked on one side. Let's see how it works on the other. Okay, now for the weird curve at the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to fold it a second time, see if that improves the finish in any way whatsoever. The corners are looking kind of messy. So, but you can see how I've got it kind of folded under, and then these ends, this corner down here is not looking fabulous. I'm just going to see if I can press that a little bit and get it to fold up, maybe. I may have to put a little crease in there. That's okay, though. This is a stiletto, in case you were wondering. I have a friend of mine who quilts told me about these, and it helps, especially in this instance where there's a lot of burning involved. Now that it's kind of done, I'm going to fold that over and just hit it hard with some steam and see if that will improve the situation, maybe. These are the little steps that are not the fun part and take the longest. I think that's going to be good enough. It's still kind of hot, but we're going to move forward. I think I'm just going to fold it like that and then just put a crease down here at the bottom. This does not seem to be working very well to try and make that curve happen. That's okay, because this is inside the dress. Let me grab a couple of pins and see if we can hold this in place until I stitch it down. It's still like crazy hot. Okay, so I think I'm going to make the executive decision, and I'm just going to fold this up bluntly, kind of overlap those corners, because this is not going to be easy to make that curve happen. And you know what? It doesn't really matter, because this is on the inside of the garment, and as long as it's finished and looks kind of nice, that's all that really matters. I'm just going to fold that up, fold this corner over like that, repeat on this side. I'm going to give this a quick press. Okay, so that's what we've got. I'm going to put my press cloth on top, give it a press, and then we're going to head back to the sewing machine. Was it just me, or did that feel like it took forever? Okay, I am going to start on one side, stitch down, pivot, go across the bottom, and then go back up the other side. And this is not going to be super perfect, but you know what? It's done. And I would much rather sew something else than fuss around with this when it is finished, and it's going to be on the inside of the garment anyway, so you're not really going to see it. I'm going to trim off the tops of these just so that that's completely even, and snip off the threads in the process. Do not need this anymore. So once it's finished, it's going to look like this. So now that this piece is all finished, I'm going to take, that's the back. I'm going to take the front of my dress. I'm going to now match with the green dots that are on my dress, and thankfully they're on both sides, and put right sides together, because this is going to get flipped to the inside eventually. And this is why we did the stay stitching, to hold this all in place during this process. Okay, the green dots are matched up. And I'm going to be sewing from the side that has the interfacing on it, because that's where I can see my marks of where we need to be. Actually, I want to pin these across because I have to stitch down along them. There we go. Okay, so that's how it should look. You should have the piece pinned, the green dots matched, and then we are going to be stitching down these lines, because we are going to cut this out and make that kind of keyhole neckline. Before I start sewing, I'm going to check the instructions one more time. So it says right sides together, pin front facing to front neck edge, matching centers and large dots, baste along the center front line, stitch along stitching lines on front facing, taking 1 or 2 stitches across the point to reinforce the point, stitch over first stitching. So basically what that means is we're going to baste it to hold it in place down the center front. There's a line there, so if you didn't mark that, make sure that you go in and do that. And then next we are going to, and I'm going to pin it down here at the bottom too. So we're going to go in, switch to basting, baste down that center front line, And next we are going to stitch down each side across the bottom and back up, and we're going to do that twice. That's what it means when it says stitch over the first stitch line. Make sure you switch your machine off of basting and back to whatever you were stitching with before. I'm using a 2.5. That is my standard stitch length. Now I am going to back tack at the top of each of these because we want to make sure this holds in place. Once we cut everything, it will be too late to find out the hard way. I just finished sewing this all in and realized the camera was not filming. So I'm not sure what happened there, but I can't rip this all out because it's done and I've sewn it twice. So that's going to be very problematic. I started here, I worked my way down. This was exactly 1 stitch length when I'm sewing at 2.5. And then I went back up the other side and then I repeated the process. So now that that is in, the next step is going to be, we're going to cut down the stitch line. This is very nerve-wracking, y'all, seriously. Okay. Okay, so there we go. And then we are going to layer the seam. So to layer this, we're going to cut one slightly closer. Let's cut the one with the interfacing because that's the thicker layer. Make sure you only cut one side for this purpose because we're layering it. We're going to get pretty close down here at the bottom. Just don't cut the stitch line. There we go. Okay, that was kind of stressfully close. On this side, we're going to repeat the process. I guess getting a little nerve-wracking. There we go. Oh, okay. That's the basting. Don't stress. Okay, and then next we're going to go in and we're going to trim this seam right next to it, but a little bit wider. If it's smaller down in the point, that is totally fine because we do want that to look neater. Okay, so that's what it should look like. I'm going to trim off all these threads that are driving me crazy. So this is a personal thing. Now we're going to turn this to the inside. See how that, I got to pull out those basting stitches because those were in the way. Okay, there's that last one. We're going to turn it all to the inside. And that looks awful. Okay, we're going to have to trim this a little bit better on this side. So I'm going to get in there and snip really close. And snip really close on this side too. And then this side as well. Because we got to get this to turn so it doesn't look lumpy. It's gonna ruin the whole front part of the dress if it's lumpy. So there we go. Okay, let's try this again. Still does not look great. Oh, it's a little bit better. It's a little bit looser in there. Okay. Let's just see what we can trim out to make this improve slightly. It might be as good as it gets because... Okay, let's flip it one more time. We're supposed to understitch this, which means we're supposed to stitch this over this way, and then this side over that way. And hopefully that will make everything look better. Let's see. Oh, it's not bad. It will be okay. We're going to do a little pressing. We're going to make everything look nice and neat. I'm going to go press this in place before we do the understitching because this is kind of thick through here. So I want to get this all pressed over so that we can understitch as much as we can, which is really only going to be about right here on each side. But let me run to the ironing board. All right, so I'm back for understitching. I'm going to start on this outside edge and then work up towards the neckline because there is not much here to grab onto after the trimming has happened. And I'm just going to backstitch once just to make sure that holds that in place because that is the whole point of understitching, is to get that seam to adhere to the facing. Okay, so see, we want this attached to the facing so that when we flip it, that made a big old mess under there. I'm just going to trim this off. I don't know what happened. Where did all that thread come from? Okay. We're just going to trim this and we're going to let it go because that was a super tiny seam. Okay, and that's going to all be on the inside of the garment, so no one's going to ever know except you. And I think you will be able to live with it like I will. So I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. Now everything should fit. Yeah, that evened out down there, so that's good. I mean, there's this tiny pucker, but I think if I go press this in place, it's going to look fine. I am going to go press this, and then I'm going to baste across this top to hold this little flap in place so that when we do attach that neckband, this is not moving around. Okay, basting is done. This is secured. I did give it a press, and you can see that that center front piece looks a lot better. It's kind of like a little flat edge on it. So pressing makes all the difference. That's why we do it as we sew. All right, so now that that is done and it turned out pretty well, I'd say. I mean, it's not A+ work, but I'd say it's a solid A-. Now we're going to sew up the side seams of the back and the front, put that together. And then comes the fun part of remembering to finish our seams. So I'm matching my notches and I'm just going to sew these up real quick. And then I'm going to go press them open, and then I am going to head to the serger to finish these side seams. Now, sometimes, like when I was threading my serger, the serger guide says to serge all the finished edges before you start sewing, but you know, when you have to put in a dart, it's kind of a pain to have that serged. So I like to go serge after I've sewn in the darts, and then that makes my life a little bit easier. Oh, and it looks like it's going to match up perfectly. I'm always so excited when that happens. Okay, let me pin the other side so that's ready to go. I also put a pin in the dart to make sure it's lying flat and it doesn't get caught in the feed dogs. You know, when you're sewing from the top of the seam down to the hem, one way you're going to be on the side with the dart and the other way you are not, and so I just like to make sure that the dart's where it's supposed to be. And I'm going to put my seam gauge back at the 5/8 inch mark because sometimes I have a hard time seeing that. Oops, I'm still on basting stitches, so make sure you take those off. I'm just going to pull out my thread. It only took one stitch. Just make sure you switch back, because the last thing we did was basting to hold the flap in place. Okay, side seams are sewn. I'm going to go press open the seams, and then I am going to finish them at the serger. If you don't have a serger, I made a video about 3 easy seam finishes. I will put it in the description below, so be sure to check that out if you want a neat and tidy finish on your seams. Next step is going to be to finish the top of the center back seam. I did press my seam allowance open to 5/8 of an inch, and now I'm just going to fold that serged edge in towards the 5/8 fold and then get that all lined up down to the opening, and I'm going to stitch it in place. So I do want to stitch as close to this edge as possible. So I think I'm going to put my presser foot there and then move my needle over one to get that a little bit closer and not have to move over my presser foot so everything feeds through the feed dogs like it's supposed to. Oh, my thread's doing something crazy. There we go. Now when you get to the bottom, the instructions say square the bottom of the seam. So I'm just going to turn this, make sure not to catch anything else underneath, and go across the bottom. Let's see if that's going to be square. Yeah. My dress is getting caught on the table. I think that is where it needs to be. Yeah, that looks okay. So that is all in, that is finished. I do need to go pull out this weird thread snarl happening here. All right, so what have we done so far? We have put in the V in the front. We have put the whole thing together with the sides and the back seam. The darts are in. The back opening is finished. So next thing is to finish the armhole. We are going to use single fold bias tape for this. Now, I am not great at bias tape. And the last time I used this to finish arms was back in 2020, and I did not do a great job. So I'm going to try and do better this time. That was when I had just started sewing regularly again. So hopefully, well, I have improved greatly since then and gotten back into the swing of things, because, you know, when you don't do it for a while, you do forget, and using single fold bias tape was not something that I really did very often. I am going to pin this open to the right side of my armhole opening. And the idea is that we are going to stitch along that fold line, and then we're going to flip it. Let's see, let's double check this, okay? Because this is one of those things. Okay, open out one edge of the single fold bias tape. Okay, so that's what we're doing. And then it says, with right sides together, pin tape to armhole edge, having crease 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Okay, let's see if that's 3/8 of an inch. I really don't know. Okay, let's see. No, it's not. Okay, so I don't know why they have to make this difficult and not just put it at the crease, but apparently they want us to do it this way. So there is going to be about 1/8 of an inch between the edge and the bias tape. So I measured it. I'm just going to eyeball this. And I don't know if this really matters that much. Like if you just lined everything up on the edge, wouldn't that be easier? Okay, so we're doing this. Stitch in 3/8 of an inch seam. So I don't know why they're making this complicated, because if you just lined it up, it would be a 1/4 inch seam. And that would mean you could also just line up the edge of your presser foot with the edge of the garment. I think we're going to do that. We're going to do this way. If you are a stickler for the instructions and you're going to be stressed by not sewing at the edge, I don't think this is going to make a huge difference. I could be wrong. We can see how that goes, but we're just finishing the armhole seam, so I don't see how that's going to make a huge difference to the rest of the garment, because it's not really going to have an effect on anything else. That might make it 1/8 of an inch bigger at the neckband, but I don't think that's going to be, I mean, that's going to be 1/8 of an inch, that'll be 1/4 of an inch, so that'll be a 1/2 inch. That might make a difference. Okay. All right, we'll measure it. We'll sew it at 3/8 of an inch, because I don't want to mess this up, and I know that the neckline is the more complicated part of this whole process. So let's try this again with enthusiasm. We got it at 3/8 of an inch again. I'm going to pin it in place and eyeball it as I go around. So this is how I am pinning. I am pinning 3/8 of an inch. We do have to pin it 3/8 of an inch, because if I just pin it to the edge and sew it 1/4 of an inch, that is potentially going to add a 1/2 inch to the whole neckline, and that will not be good once we go and put that on if there's any kind of problems. So since this is the first time I'm making this, I do not want to cause any problems or tell you to do it the wrong way. That is the alternative. So this is a measuring gauge. I'm using this 3/8 inch mark here. It's a little bit easier than using the seam gauge that has the slider on it, because this tends to just stay exactly where it's supposed to be. So that's my 3/8 inch mark. I'm going to put in a pin. If you want to get one of these little bad boys, I'll put a link in the description below. It is super, super handy. It's also really good when you can't see the lines marked on your sewing machine and you just need to figure out which one is which. All right, so I got everything pinned into place, and then once I gotten it lined up with my, and I can't find my seam gauge. I don't know where it went. Okay, I just have to be okay with that. Oh, here it is. I stick it on this magnetic piece down here. Okay, so I'm gonna line up my seam gauge at 3/8 of an inch so I can keep the outside edge of my fabric. And when I have that lined up, that means that the needle is going to be on the fold line of the single fold bias tape. So that is the good news. It does look like it is working. So let me show you how I'm going to put this all together. I did switch my needle back to the center position, and I did raise my machine so I can get the bulk of this armhole underneath it, and that will also make the sewing a lot easier. So my edge, this is at 3/8 of an inch, and then you can see right here that the needle is lined up on the crease. That means everything is where it's supposed to be, all is right in the world. And if I need to just make sure these two things line up, we will do that as the sewing progresses. I am just going to backstitch that a little bit to make sure that holds in place. Both of the bias tapes are sewn to the armholes. Next, we need to trim the seam, and next we are going to do some understitching. Now, this is the part of the instructions that gets kind of confusing, and I had to read this 3 times before I figured it out. So it says stitch 3/8 inch seam. We did that. We're going to layer the seam, so I'm going to trim this down, trim down the edge of the bias tape, but then also trim down the edge of the armhole. And then it says understitch facing. Now you may be thinking like, where's the facing? The tape is the facing. So you're going to, once we trim everything down, we're going to stitch again against the tape to hold that seam away from the armhole and attach it to the bias tape. And then we're going to fold it to the inside and stitch it again. What that's going to do is prevent the tape from peeking out on the right side of the armhole. So I don't know why they just didn't continue to call it tape, but I'm not the one who writes the pattern instructions. So I'm just going to go in and trim this out carefully because I do not want to cut the stitch line. And then I will go in and cut the fabric underneath the bias tape. When you are trimming, you want to make sure that you trim it down so that it's not overlapping the other top fold of the single fold bias tape, because we don't want that additional bulk in there. Next, we're getting ready to go in and understitch the seam edge to the bias tape. Now in the instructions, it just refers to it as the facing. We're using the bias tape as the facings, but make sure that your seam edge is not covering that other fold of the bias tape. So what we want to do next is head to the ironing board and press this over towards the bias tape. This is one of those steps that is not included in the instructions, but it's going to make a huge difference, and it's going to make the understitching much easier because you know you're going to have a nice crisp edge. And that's the whole point of understitching, is to pull that seam edge over towards the facing and hold it in place so that once you finish and we flip it all towards the inside, you're going to have a really nice, neat line up there. And the facing, the bias tape, is going to be pulled towards the inside of the armhole where you're not going to see it. I am using my pressing hand for this because this is going to keep this nice and curved, which is what I want. And I'm just pressing from the inside of the garment to press that seam over towards the bias tape so that when we understitch, everything's going to get caught. Now that my seam is pressed over towards the bias tape, we're going to do some understitching. I'm getting everything lined up, and I am just going to sew as close to that edge as I can without catching that other folded edge of the bias tape. So you can see I have my seam. So this is the stitch line that we use to connect the bias tape to the armhole. I'm just going to line up that on the inside edge of my presser foot right here, and then I am just going to leave my needle in the center position and then just stitch and make sure that I do not catch this while I'm doing that. So I'm back pressing again, and pressing in this type of garment construction is going to make your entire finished garment look a lot better. It's going to look more professional. It's going to look neater. And it's going to prevent, specifically in this instance of pressing, it's going to keep that bias tape rolled to the inside, and that's going to make it a lot easier to get that top stitching in and just make the whole thing look neat and crisp along that edge when you finally get around to wearing it. Now that we have the seam finish all pressed over to the inside and that's all ready to go, we're going to stitch it down. Now, if you read the instructions, it says to, let me get to the right spot, it says to turn the tape to the inside press. We did that. Baste close to the inner edge of the tape, and then on the outside, top stitch as basted. Now, I'm not clear on if they want us to stitch over the top stitching. That's what I would think reading this the way that it's written, but that's going to make things kind of messy. And if you get off of the basting line as you're going through the curve of the underarm seam, that's going to be a pain to try and get out or remove if you've got two different lines there. So I've come up with a different solution, and I did test this out on the other armhole. That is the beauty of having two to work with. So to get started, I am going to line up my presser foot with the outside edge of the bias tape. I am going to move my needle over one from center towards the left, and I'm going to set my machine to basting. So I'm going to put in a basting stitch, and then we'll go back in and stitch even closer to the outside edge with the top stitching, and then that is going to allow us to remove that basting stitch without any problems. We'll catch the outside edge or the inside edge of the bias tape to keep it nice and tight and smooth, and it's going to work and look fabulous. So we're going off instructions right now. The outside edge of my bias tape is right here along the edge of my presser foot. This is what they're calling the inside edge. I guess this is the outside edge. And I've set my machine to basting, and my needle is moved over one to the left from center. We're just going to baste this in place, keeping this edge lined up the whole time and just going around slowly to make sure everything stays lined up. All right, so we've got that basting stitch in, and then we're going to go and line up the basting stitch with the center mark line of the presser foot. So we're going to get that lined up, and then I'm going to move my needle one more over to the left. So now it's on the very far side, and that's going to catch the edge of the tape right here, right between the basting stitch line and the outside edge. And I'm going to reset my machine to my usual stitch length of 2.5. Don't forget to do that. And then we're just going to stitch. Once you're finished, you should have your top stitch line in place. You should still have your basting stitch in. If you flip this to the other side, you can see that you've got your top stitch line that's going to be close to the edge. And then if you go in, pull out the basting stitch and give your garment a quick press along those armholes. This is what it's going to look like. So it'll be neat and tidy. You'll have a nice smooth edge here, 2 rows of stitching on the inside. That edge is going to be caught securely, and no puckering or rippling along here. We're going to have a really nice looking armhole seam. Okay, at this point, we have finished all the way through step number 8, and that took a really long time considering that it's only 8 steps. But I think it's what the pattern instructions don't tell you that, really makes the difference if you take the time to press in between the steps, even though the instructions don't say to. And next we're going to move on to the neckband that is going to connect all of this together and make the dress wearable. So this is the part where it starts to look a little bit complicated. I think this is the step, or the next few steps are going to be the ones that prevent this from being an easy pattern. So let's get started. Step 9 is interface. Apply the interfacing. Already did that. Sew them together. Already did that. And then the last thing we need to do is machine stitch along the notched edge. So we're going to be putting a line of stitching in across this bottom edge where these notches are. And then we're going to repeat the entire process with the facing. So the neckband is the one with the interfacing, the facing is the one without interfacing, and we are going to stitch both of these along the bottom notched edge before we move on to step number 2. So the reason we're doing this and putting in this stitch line is because later in the process, we are going to be folding the edge of the neckband into itself so that we can finish it after we have attached the connecting points at the front neck and on the back. So it'll make sense as we get to it, but this is a critical step, so do not forget to do this. We're sewing at 5/8 of an inch because that is the seam allowance on this pattern. And I'm just going to use my magnetic gauge to get me all lined up. And this is just a regular stitch. This is not basting or anything fancy like that. Okay, that one's done, and I think my bobbin just ran out of thread. Let's double check. Well, that worked out well because it was right at the end of the seam. I do have a second bobbin threaded and ready to go, so I'm just going to pop that one in real quick. Oops. And then we'll move on to sew the same stitch line on the facing. All right, now that we have the seams sewn in, or the stitch lines sewn in, we are going to attach the neckband and the facing to each other, right sides together. We're going to match them up at these side seams and at the, I think it's just side seams. I don't think there's any notches. No, just side seams. And next we are going to be stitching the span. I'm going to put the interfacing side down because that's going to be the thicker side. So I'm going to pin these together, making sure my seam allowances are open because I do not want to get one caught the wrong way. That's going to make some lumps. And then we are going to stitch along the neck edge. So we're going to be sewing on this inside edge that will be against our neck once we finally get that all put together. Okay, so this is matching. That always makes me happy when everything is matching where it's supposed to be. Let me just finish pinning these edges. I'm going to roll my needle down to get that going. We're just stitching this inside line. It's very basic at this point, not too complicated. We're going to make this happen. Now that that seam is all put in, oh wow, that's off on this side. Ugh, I hate it. It drives me crazy when this happens. So I don't know what to do about it. It's matched up everywhere else, so I'm just not going to stress about it. I guess the fabric stretched a little bit. Yeah. So I'm ripping this out because I realized that I should have put the facing side down so the fabric could feed evenly. The feed dogs could help out with that, easing in, because once I finished sewing and looked at it, then I realized that some of the notches were not matching up along the bottom edge, and I do not want to have any problems doing the attaching points of all of this. So I'd rather just make sure this is done right the first time. Now, obviously, if it's good enough for you, you don't have to do this, but since I'm demoing this whole sewing process, I wanted to make sure I did it right, and just to avoid any created problems because I didn't sew this the right way. So for future reference, put the facing side down. That way the fabric will ease with the feed dogs, and well, hopefully it'll ease with the feed dogs. We'll find out. I'll do that this time around. Fingers crossed. So I got it all pinned back together. I do have the centers matched to the other side. I did also put some pins in the bottom notches just to hold everything in place. I'm going to sew this again. Hopefully nothing moves this time. Okay, second time's a charm. Definitely sew it with the facing down because now both ends are even. Everything else is smooth. Next step is going to be to trim out the seam because we are going to be doing, yes, more understitching. So we are understitching it towards the facing. So I'm going to trim the interfacing side narrower because that's also the thicker one, and then trim the facing side of the seam a little bit longer so we can grade those seam allowances. So I'm going to cut this one, the interfacing side, in half. And then I'll leave the other one just peeking out along the edge just a little bit. Because the thing about this is we don't want to cut them too small because we do have to catch them to make the understitching happen. So I have done this where I've gotten overly enthusiastic and then the understitching doesn't catch. So then that kind of defeats that whole purpose. All right, so the first piece is done. We're going to go back in and trim out that facing edge so it's just kind of like right next to the interfacing, so it looks like that, and just go all the way around. Now that the grading is done, we have to understitch to get this seam to go towards the facing side. And this is one of those steps that is hard to see because I was looking at the picture and it is diagram 11, and that is after it has been edge stitched. And when you look at it, you're like, that looks like that's been understitched, not edge stitched, understitched. But then you're like, where does it say that? So at the very top of number 11, it says for views A and B understitch facing. And it looks more like a header than actually instructions. So that's where that is. Right sides together, pin the facing to the lower edge of the neckband. And so then you move on to the next steps. So if you miss that line where it says understitch facing in all caps, so it looks like it's a header, yeah, that's where you need to do that. Pressing is going to make this whole understitching process a lot easier. And this is like the weird part of this step because next we're going to be pulling the facing down to the notches, and so it's going to kind of roll, but that's what we want, so don't stress. And I need a press cloth. Where did that go? Kitty was up here earlier making a mess, so I'll find it. The iron has to get hot anyway. So if we're understitching, we're going to have to press first. This is going to get everything nice and folded over to the facing side. When it says understitch facing, that means that we are stitching it to the facing. So I've got my iron nice and hot. I'm going to steam along this whole part to make sure that it's got a nice crease because we want to make sure this is going to go the direction it's supposed to once we get to the next step. So I'm going to be stitching on the, let me do it this way. I don't know why I'm going that way. The interfacing side, I'm going to line up my presser foot with the seam edge along the interfacing, and then I am just going to be stitching this in place. And I'm going to probably have to move my needle over because the interfacing edge is a little bit short. So sometimes that happens. So you can kind of see how it's puckering here a little bit. I'm just going to pull that straight as I stitch. And hopefully that works. Because while it looks like the pieces are notched, once we get to another stage, at this point it has said nothing about clipping or notching this seam. Okay, moment of truth. Let's see how that looks. It's not bad, not great. It's a little puckered. Let's see the other one. So I figured out where the instructions messed up. So you have 9, which was to put the interfacing on the neck band. And then here in 10, you're supposed to prepare the neckband section, same as above minus interfacing. And then you're supposed to stitch this next edge. Well, these notches magically appeared and there's no mention of them. But we need them in order to be able to make the understitching happen here because I'm getting hung up in these curves where the seam is not expanding and nothing related to clipping this. So apparently, based on 10, you're supposed to figure out by looking at this diagram that you need to do some clipping along that curved seam, which, yes, might be intuitive, but at the same time, it would be really nice. It said it somewhere over here, instead of just making me guess that that's what was happening and then figuring out that that's what we need to make this happening in this understitch facing. Looks like a header, not really instructions like these are. Anyway, I'm going to rip out the understitching and start again. Okay, the underfacing is all ripped out. I have notched the inner neckband, which was not included in the instructions. Now, usually I just clip because I don't ever know if the notches are in the right place, or if they're small enough, whatever. So I've also clipped between the wedge trapezoidal shapes of the notches. That's going to give me enough movement in there so that when I do understitch, it's all going to ease out. And you can already see that as soon as I flip it over, it's starting to relax, and the fabric is, it's going to act right this time around. So I'm going to go back and do some more understitching for the second time around. And then hopefully that problem will be solved and we can move on to the next step. I'm starting to feel better because now it actually looks like the drawing on the diagram. So you've got your little notches, you got your understitching. These marks are all matching up. So all the notches are matching up where they're supposed to, which is also making me feel a lot better about the whole process. And then next we are going to be stitching between, this is where it starts to get a little complicated. Okay, so we're going to stitch between these two dots. We're going to leave this open. Then we are going to stitch between this dot and leave this open. So this is when the marking really comes in handy. You have to make sure that you have all these marks in place, because otherwise this will not go together properly. So I'm going to start at the center front dots. I'm just going to stitch on that stitch line I've already got because I know that's 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to back stitch at each dot to hold that in place. I'm going to move my needle back where it was. There we go. Now everything's lining up properly. Okay. All right. So first set of dots is done. Now we're going to go from the small back shoulder to the front shoulder. Okay, so I've got my stitching sewn in. Where are we? We're on this side still on this page. So we're at this stage now. We need to clip at the dots, and then we are going to trim or grade the seams between those notches. And then we're going to flip it so that the right side is out. But let's get these clips in first. And then we will trim it out. Trim it out from the interfacing side. Maybe not. There we go. Now that things are all trimmed and graded, we are going to flip this. This is step number 12. Turn neckband right side out through opening in the back. So through this bigger opening, we're going to turn the rest of the neckband through. So I just recorded a whole segment and didn't realize that my microphone had turned itself off somehow. So I was just pinning the neckband side to the right side of the garment, matching up the notches, and make sure you take your time to get everything lined up where it needs to be. And then I stitched the front part here with the V. I'm not looking at it yet because it doesn't look like it looks great, but we will figure that out once we get this all finished. I don't think there's really anything I can do at this point. I am going to stitch the back pieces together at the back neckband to the back center back. Just when you're sewing, make sure that you pull that facing out of the way so it doesn't get caught, because you do not want that to happen, because that's going to cause more problems once we try and flip everything over. Oh shoot. It's just what I told you not to do. I caught the facing under there. All right, let's do a little bit more ripping. Thankfully it wasn't too much. Okay, so one side is done. So the other one. So I realized that nothing is lining up exactly right. And so what I'm going to go back and do is stitch on top of the line from the original marking at the bottom of the neckband that we put in from the very beginning. That was like the first thing we stitched, was just that stitch line. I'm going to follow that line and see if that makes things line up better. So this is the one I just sewed. This is the original line, and the one I just sewed is not quite in the right place. So let me try this. Yeah, see, that's where it's supposed to be. This is still kind of a mess there. I'm gonna have to rip that out there, but you can see that, like, you can't see that marking line, and that's where it's supposed to be. And that's the side seam over there. So let's go around to the front. Yeah, see how this is off here? If we go back and stitch on that, then everything's gonna line up where it's supposed to. What about on this side? Yeah, see, same thing here. This is the line we need to work with, which means we have to stitch it from the interfacing side. You can see how much I'm off there. This is the right one, the one that's on the inside. The one that's on the outside is the one I stitched. I don't have to rip that out. I can just go sew on top of it. And neater, it's not perfect right through here, but I'm gonna go pull that out and then fix it. But you can see I've redid that on the back, each back panel, and where it's a little bit, you can see that stitch line, I'll have to go in and just hand stitch that to make it all line up the way it's supposed to. Next, we are going to press the seam up into there, and then we're going to fold this up and give it all a good press, and then I'm going to pin it in place because that's going to require some hand sewing to slip stitch that all in place. Should be along this line in theory. Okay. All right. Next step is putting on the little loops. Now, the instructions tell you to fold the little tab that looks like this. This is piece number, either 6 or 9. 6. So it's the loop from 9. You fold this in half. It said to sew it at a scant 1/4 of an inch. So I lined up the edge of the loop with my presser foot and then moved my needle over to the far right to make a very tiny little seam. And then it says to use a needle to turn it, and that did not work for me. So instead I used one of my point turners. These are awesome. They come in a set of 2. This is the small one for like a 1/4 of an inch. The other I think is a 1/2 inch. They will change your life. You will never have to fight with trying to use a safety pin or a needle or something to flip things. And I will put a link in the description below so you can check those out if you have struggled with that for many years. So now we're going to cut this in half. We're going to match this up to the dot marks on the facing. I think they're on the facing. I don't think it matters which ones you attach. Let's check the instructions. Let's find out for sure. Back left, neckband facing, fold loops in half on the outside, pin loops to left back facing. Oh, so we're going to pin these to the outside. I can see them. Okay, so they're on the facing, and I do have my marks marked. So we're just going to kind of loop them in half so that each end matches with the dots, and I'm just going to put a pin in them, making sure to only pin the facing. And then we'll go down to the other one. I'm putting the seam on the bottom because I think that just looks neater. That helps you figure out how to put them on. Okay, so I've got one here. I have the other one down here. Okay, so those are pinned in place. Next, we are going to baste them in place. Or you know what, we'll just run the stitch over them. That's going to be the fastest option at this point. Okay, so those are basted on now. Next, I believe we're going to fold things like this and then stitch. So let's double check that. Yeah, and then we're going to stitch this down. Stitch that all together. Is that how it goes? Oh yeah, so we're going to stitch it with the band going up. So, all right. going to fold the bottom of the band where we put in that stitch line that we stitched along earlier. That's going to get folded up into the band there, and then, oh, but we're going to do it this way. We're going to do it this way. So then we'll stitch this piece together, hold everything in place, and then repeat on the other side, and then we'll flip it and then do some hand stitching to hold everything in place once and for all. All right, the whole inside of the facing is stitched down to the neckband. I did finish the loops. I sewed in some buttons. So the very last step we have is to finish the hem. Now, I didn't try this on yet, so fingers crossed it fits, but I did hold it up to myself to see the length of the hem, and the pattern recommends 1.25 inch hem. So I think that's just what I'm going to do. It's going to hit at the right spot and be right around my knee. And if you've never used a Dritz Easy Hem, this is what it looks like. I am pressing in the hem at the 1.25 inch mark right here. So I'm just getting that all lined up. And then once I get that pressed in, I'm going to go in and press it in 1/4 inch, which is on that side, and then fold it back up, and we'll have a neatly finished hem that will be ready to sew. So I'm just going to go around. If you don't have one of these, I'll put a link in the description. This is fantastic. This is the same one I've had since college because they last forever and they're just really great. They make putting in hems super easy. And then there's also a curved side. So on the other edge, you have 5/8 here, but then you have all the regular measurements on this side as well if you're doing a curved hem instead of straight hem. So the hem is pressed into place. I am just going to stitch along the top edge, starting at the center back seam. Let me make sure I find that one. And just stitch it all the way around. This blue thread matches really, really well, and it's going to look fine. It's not going to be terribly noticeable. Plus, this is kind of a sporty dress. There is some top stitching around the armholes, so no stress there about having a visible stitch line. Plus, I'm just ready to get this done. So this is step number 22, if you're counting and following along. I'm going to move my needle over, so it's going to be very, very close to that edge, and stitching at 2.5 length. So this turned out a lot cuter than I thought it would. Even when I was just, ironing out the creases and the center front fold, I still wasn't 100% sure. And it wasn't really until I put it on that I was like, oh, that is a super cute dress. I did end up making it in the 14. I'm really glad that I made that choice because a 16 would be way too big. There is enough ease in this to hide all the lumps and bumps, but it fits in the bust, which is where it's supposed to, and up here at the top of the back. So I'm happy with the way that turned out. The other thing I am super excited about is that I can wear a regular bra with this dress. I thought I was going to have to crisscross it, and actually when I did, then you could see the straps through the neckline. So if that is a concern of yours and you do not want to have to go wear a strapless bra, this works perfectly fine with a regular bra. So that's another added bonus. I kind of was iffy about that, but I'm really excited to know that. And we're going to look into it at a little bit more detail. I'm going to take this off and put it back on the dress form so I can go in for a close-up and show you some of the points and how they all turned out. So this is the dress on my dress form. You can see that everything's lying flat. The loops are a little bit loose, so I think I'm going to go in and stitch them together in the middle. This upper one doesn't quite grab the button like it quite should. But all in all, the dress looks really cute. It is knee length. It's a perfect length. It's a great summer A-line dress, super comfortable. And because it's made in this really nice cotton sateen, it's going to be super comfortable to wear all summer long. Now, there are a couple of tiny errors. The neckband here, you can kind of see the wrong side. You can see the facing side peeking under. I think that's because I didn't sew it at exactly the right spot. But where I went back and attached the rest of the neckband to the various parts of the dress, I did go back in and stitch at the marking line on the interfacing that we did, that 5/8 inch stitch. I just put in a line. It did line up correctly. So I didn't realize that when I started at the middle point, but that's okay. And then There's still a little bit of stitching I need to rip out that you can see from the right side of the garment. That was also because I didn't sew it at exactly the right spot. But all in all, not a big deal. Nobody's ever going to notice except me. So I would say it's definitely a win. If you want more inspiration and exciting sew along, you totally want to check this video out. It's coming up next. I know you're going to love it, and I'll see you over there.